The dress was simple. No lace, no beads, no veil. Just a pale ivory fabric that fell straight to the floor, modest at the neckline, sleeves ending at her wrists. It wasn't the kind of dress Ellis Wynn had imagined wearing on her wedding day. Then again, nothing about this day resembled the kind of wedding she might have once dreamt of when she was a little girl. There were no flowers, no music, no smiling faces waiting with happy tears. Just silence. Thick and stale, like the air inside the small chapel on the edge of the Reese property, where the windows hadn't been opened in months. She sat still in the wooden chair beside the altar, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her fingers had turned white from the pressure she was unknowingly applying to them. Her mother, seated a few rows back, had said nothing to her that morning. Just handed her the dress, pressed a light kiss to her forehead and whispered, "Be good, Ellis. It's done." That was all, as if goodness would be enough to carry her through what was about to happen. The doors creaked open precisely at noon, and the man she was to marry stepped inside. Callum Reese didn't look at her. He walked straight down the aisle with the calm stride of someone walking into a meeting, not a marriage. He wore a dark gray jacket that hung heavy on broad shoulders, a crisp white shirt beneath it, and jeans. Dark and clean, but still jeans. His boots were scuffed, his expression unreadable. His eyes, when he reached the front and finally turned toward her, were pale blue like river ice. Cold, still, and impossibly quiet. He didn't offer a hand, didn't greet her, just stood there, a man carved from restraint. The officiant, a retired pastor brought in only for legal formality, began the ceremony without introduction. There was no exchange of vows, no "I love you," no "from this day forward," only the bare minimum, a name, a signature, a ring, a contract dressed up in ritual. Callum slipped the simple gold band onto Ellis's finger without touching her skin. His hand was steady. Hers trembled. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat felt tight, like if she tried to talk, something inside her might break loose. And then it was done. The officiant closed the book and nodded once. "By the authority vested in me by the state of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." No applause followed, just the rustling of paper and the distant creak of a wooden bench as someone, probably Lucinda Reese, his mother, stood to leave. Callum didn't kiss her, didn't even look at her again. He turned to the exit and waited. Ellis followed because she didn't know what else to do. She stepped out into the warm afternoon air. The sky stretched wide and blue over the mountain range, and for a brief moment, the sun struck her face and blinded her. It felt like stepping out of one world and into another, the world where she no longer belonged to herself. They didn't ride in the same car. She sat in the back seat of an old pickup, Lucinda beside her. The older woman didn't smile, but there was a softness in her eyes that Ellis hadn't expected. She spoke first, voice low and lined with fatigue. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Lucinda said. "It's not what I wanted for you either. But Callum, he needs someone, and he doesn't know how to ask for help. He barely knows how to speak to people anymore." Ellis stared out the window, watching the dusty road stretch back toward the chapel. "Then why me?" Lucinda sighed. "Because when your father asked me to take care of you, he knew you were strong. Quiet, yes, but strong. And because you're the kind of girl who won't flinch at silence." That answer didn't comfort Ellis, but it stayed with her. The drive to the ranch house was long and winding. The land rolled in waves of green and gold. Wild grass swaying in the breeze, fences marking off pastures with distant silhouettes of horses grazing peacefully. The house itself was large but old, built of dark wood, with a deep wraparound porch and windows that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't welcoming either. It just stood there, like it had always stood there, waiting. Callum had arrived before them. He stood on the porch, one hand in his pocket, watching her as she stepped out of the truck. He didn't help with her small suitcase, didn't speak, just opened the door and held it until she walked past him. The inside of the house smelled of cedar and something faintly metallic, like old tools. The floors creaked beneath her feet, the air cool and still. He led her to a small room on the second floor with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window facing the barn. "This will be yours," he said. His voice was deep, rough like gravel, but not unkind. "Just closed." She nodded once. If you need anything, Lucinda's downstairs. She wanted to ask him, what about you? Where will you be? But the words stayed stuck. He turned and left without another word. She sat on the bed after he left, her suitcase unopened at her feet. The quiet pressed in around her like weight. No music, no television, no footsteps. Only wind against the windows and the creak of old wood. She had just married a stranger, and now she was living in his house wearing his ring, sleeping under his roof. But she had never felt more alone. The next morning came quietly, with the pale light of dawn filtering through gauzy curtains and casting long, faint shadows across the wooden floorboards of Ellis's new bedroom. She lay awake long before the sun had fully risen, staring at the ceiling as if trying to memorize its every imperfection. Sleep had come in fits, light, restless, and full of uncertainty. The room she'd been given was not cold, not unpleasant, but it wasn't hers. Nothing here was, not the walls, not the linens, not even the air that seemed to hold a weight she hadn't yet learned how to breathe. There were no sounds from the hallway, no footsteps, no murmurs, no sign of life. Still in her cotton nightgown, she sat on the edge of the bed and let her bare feet press into the cool wood. It grounded her in a way, reminded her that she hadn't imagined yesterday, that the dress, the ceremony, the silence, it had all been real. She had signed the marriage certificate with a hand that barely stopped trembling. Her name was now Ellis Reese, even though no one had said it aloud. Even though the man whose name she now bore had barely looked at her. When she finally stepped out of her room, the house still carried that strange, quiet breath it had the day before. She padded softly down the stairs, the boards creaking beneath her weight in a way that made her feel like she was intruding. The kitchen was already warm with the scent of coffee and baking bread. Lucinda stood at the stove, her thin frame draped in a cardigan, her gray hair tied into a neat bun. She looked up and offered a small, tight smile. "Morning, sweetheart," she said gently. "I didn't hear you come down." "I tried not to make noise," Ellis said, her voice hoarse from disuse. Lucinda poured her a cup of coffee without asking and set it on the table, motioning for her to sit. "It's all right. This old house has been waiting too long to hear a second set of steps. You're welcome to make all the noise you want." Ellis sat cautiously, cupping the mug in her hands, grateful for the warmth even though she didn't drink coffee. She didn't say that, though. It felt rude, and Lucinda didn't deserve rudeness. "Callum's out already," the older woman said, glancing toward the window where the barn could be seen in the distance. "He gets up before the sun. Always has. The horses settle better when he's there first." Ellis nodded, sipping the bitter drink slowly, willing herself not to wince. "He doesn't talk much," Lucinda continued, wiping her hands on a towel. "Never has, really. But after May—" Her voice trailed off. She turned to lean against the counter, eyes somewhere far away. "It got worse. Losing her, it changed him." Ellis looked up. The name May was unfamiliar, but carried weight, as though spoken softly in reverence. "Was she his wife?" Lucinda shook her head. "No, but close. She was supposed to be. They were engaged. A week before the wedding, there was an accident. She fell from one of the young stallions, one he'd been training for years. No one's really sure what spooked the animal, but she landed wrong. Neck broke instantly. She died before help even got there." Ellis felt the words settle over her like a shroud. She hadn't known what kind of man Callum was, only that he seemed distant, unreadable. But now she understood that part of his silence wasn't coldness. It was grief. Lucinda's eyes softened when they met hers. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know. Callum didn't ask for this marriage. Neither did you. But I asked it of him. He's a good man, Ellis, but he's not healed. I don't know if he ever will be. I didn't want him to spend the rest of his life alone." Ellis nodded slowly. She appreciated the honesty, even if it didn't fix anything. At least now she had a shape to place around the silence, a history to explain the distance. After breakfast, Lucinda offered her a tour of the house. The rooms were large, filled with heavy furniture and muted colors. Everything looked used but well kept, like it had a long life before her arrival. There were no photographs on the walls, no trinkets on shelves, nothing that offered a glimpse into who Callum had been before. Loss made him the man he was now. Ellis spent most of the afternoon alone, wandering the grounds. The ranch was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. Hills rolled gently out into the distance, and beyond them the tree line rose up like a wall of green against the pale sky. Horses grazed in the distance, and their soft sounds, the rustle of movement, the occasional snort, were the only sounds that didn't feel foreign. She avoided the barn, sensing instinctively that it was his space. She didn't want to step into it without an invitation. By late afternoon, she found herself back inside, unsure of what to do with herself. There was no television in her room, no books that belonged to her. She unpacked her suitcase slowly, folding each item into drawers as if claiming the space by inches. When she placed the final item, a small, worn paperback she'd brought from home, on the nightstand, it felt like the first thing in this place that was truly hers. Dinner was quiet. Callum had come in just as the sun started to dip low behind the hills, covered in dust and smelling faintly of hay and sweat. He washed up in the downstairs bathroom and sat at the table without a word. Lucinda served stew and cornbread, filling the silence with talk about the horses, the weather, a neighbor's new calf. Callum nodded occasionally, said little. Ellis kept her eyes on her plate. She ate slowly, carefully. Every time she lifted her eyes and caught Callum looking at her, even briefly, something clenched in her chest. Not fear, something closer to confusion, uncertainty. It was like looking at a man whose edges had been blurred by sorrow, who had forgotten how to be looked at. When the dishes were cleared and Lucinda had retired upstairs, Callum remained at the table for a moment longer. Ellis stood to leave, thinking he would too, but his voice stopped her. I can move you to the east room if this one's too small. She turned, surprised to hear him speak directly. No, it's fine, thank you. He nodded once, then quieter. I don't expect anything. From you. I know, she said, though part of her wasn't sure what that meant. He stood tall and solid in the low light. Good night, Ellis. Good night, Callum. And with that, he left. Upstairs in her small room, Ellis sat on the bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a door shut gently. The wind shifted, rattling a shutter. The night pressed in around her like a heavy quilt. She was married to a stranger, but he wasn't cruel. He was just lost. And now so was she. The following days passed like a soft wind, quiet, consistent, and oddly heavy with things unsaid. Ellis began to fall into the rhythm of life on the ranch, though it still felt like stepping into someone else's shoes. Every morning, she rose just after dawn, long after Callum had left the house. She'd wake to the sounds of birdsong outside her window, the creak of Lucinda moving downstairs, and the distant hum of work already being done across the wide stretch of fields. She would pad barefoot to the kitchen and find Lucinda at the stove, or humming softly by the window, knitting or shelling peas into a bowl. The older woman never fussed or imposed. She simply made space for silence, for gentle companionship, for the slow bloom of something that might one day feel like family. Ellis filled her time with chores she hadn't been asked to do. She wiped windows, swept porches, folded laundry that wasn't hers, not because she felt obligated, but because stillness made her nervous. In motion, her thoughts slowed. She didn't have to ask herself what she was doing here, or what it meant to be a wife in name only. The silence in the house gave her room to observe. She began to notice little things. How Callum left his boots precisely aligned by the door. How he never touched the photos stacked in a dusty box beneath the staircase. How Lucinda's breath became shallower in the evening when the pain from her illness overtook her ability to pretend. There was grief embedded into the bones of the place, not just in its people, but in the walls themselves. One afternoon, Ellis ventured beyond the porch to the fence line, where she could just see the stables beyond a long hill. The day was warm, the sky a bold shade of blue, and the fields glittered in the light with swaying wildflowers and tall, dry grass. The horses were out, a few near the edges of the pasture, but she spotted Callum further out, working with a dark brown stallion. He moved slowly, deliberately, leading the animal in circles on a long rope, his voice low and steady, inaudible from her distance. The horse responded well, its hooves pressing into the earth in a graceful rhythm. There was a stillness to Callum in that moment, a gentleness in his movements that Ellis had never seen in him elsewhere. She didn't approach. Instead, she sat quietly on a fallen log near the fence, just watching, not wanting to interrupt. Minutes passed. then nearly an hour. And then, without turning or calling out, Callum raised his head, his gaze sweeping the landscape until it landed directly on her. It wasn't a startled look. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply watched her for a moment, long enough to make her feel like her presence had weight, then gave a small nod before returning to the horse. That evening after supper, Lucinda went to bed earlier than usual. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed in fatigue, though she never complained. Ellis had offered to bring her tea, but the older woman waved her off with a tired smile and disappeared up the stairs. Left alone in the quiet kitchen, Ellis lingered by the sink, washing dishes in warm water, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. She didn't hear Callum enter behind her until she felt the shift in the air. She turned slightly and saw him leaning against the doorframe, his shirt sleeves also rolled, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. "You were out by the fence today," he said. Her fingers paused in the water. "I didn't mean to disturb anything." "You didn't." He hesitated. "You were quiet. Most people don't know how to be." Ellis rinsed the last plate, dried her hands slowly, and turned to face him. "I've spent most of my life learning how to be invisible. Quiet is easy." He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt the force of it deep in her chest. He had eyes that could flay a person open without a single word. But tonight they didn't carry judgment or frustration, just something she couldn't name. Not quite sorrow, not quite curiosity. "You don't need to be invisible here," he said. The room fell into a delicate silence. She stepped away from the sink, crossing her arms in front of her as if trying to hold herself together. "This doesn't feel like my home," she admitted. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." He nodded as if he understood. "It didn't feel like mine for a long time either." There was something in the way he said it that made her ask softly, "When did it start to?" He thought for a long time before replying. "The day after she died, I walked out into the stables and tried to sell every horse I own. I called auction houses. I tore up training schedules. I wanted it all gone, but no one came. No one would buy. And the horses, they kept standing there like they were waiting for something, like they didn't know she was gone. That morning, one of the foals she'd raised from birth came and stood at the barn door. Just stood there, breathing, not moving, not making a sound. I stood on the other side and I didn't open it. I couldn't. I leaned against the wall and cried like a child. For hours, when I came out again, the foal was still there." Ellis listened, breath caught in her throat. "That's the moment," he said. "That's when I realized that even when you want to destroy everything, some things refuse to go. The land, the animals, the air, the pain. It all stays. So you either walk with it or you don't walk at all." "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't be. I didn't tell you so you'd feel sorry. I told you because I know what it's like to live in someone else's silence." Their eyes met again, and this time it didn't feel accidental. Something passed between them, delicate and tentative, but real. She moved first, offering a quiet nod, then turned to gather the dish towel. "I'll dry these and head up. Thank you for telling me." He pushed off the door frame slowly. "Thank you for listening." As he left the room, Ellis stood still for a moment, staring down at her hands. They were trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of being seen after so long in the dark. That night she lay in bed awake again, but not from discomfort. Her thoughts spun differently now, not with confusion or helplessness, but with curiosity. Wonder. Callum Reese was a man broken by the past, and somehow, without trying, she had found a crack in his silence. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but for the first time since she arrived, she wanted to stay long enough to find out. The morning after their quiet conversation in the kitchen, Ellis awoke to the low rumble of thunder rolling in the distance. The sky outside her window was pale gray, layered with thick clouds that clung to the tops of the hills like heavy wool. The light in her room was dim and cool, the kind that made everything look older, softer, like it belonged to another time. She sat up slowly, drawing the quilt around her shoulders, and listened for the usual early sounds of the house. The creak of the stairs, Lucinda moving about in the kitchen, Callum's boots hitting the porch steps. But the house was unusually still. She dressed in a long-sleeved flannel shirt and jeans, her fingers moving automatically now through routines that had once felt foreign. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was familiarity. and that was something. Downstairs, she found Lucinda seated in her usual spot near the window, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders and a small notebook open in her lap. She looked up when Ellis entered, her eyes tired but kind. "Morning, darling," Lucinda said. "Storm's coming in fast. You might want to stay in today." "I don't mind the rain," Ellis replied. "Where's Callum?" Lucinda gave a small nod toward the barn. "He's been out there since dawn. He doesn't wait on the weather." Ellis thanked her quietly and filled the kettle, setting it on the stove to boil. As the rain began to tap softly against the windows, she took her tea by the back door and watched through the screen as wind danced through the grass and the sky darkened to a deeper shade of gray. She could just make out the outline of the barn, the wide open doors swinging gently with the wind. A single figure moved inside, tall and solitary, Callum. She should have stayed indoors. She knew that, but something tugged at her, some quiet urge to step further into his world. She grabbed her raincoat from the hook by the door and slipped on her boots. The air outside was damp and smelled of wet earth and pine. The path to the barn had grown muddy, but she moved carefully, head down, until she reached the entrance. Inside, the space was warmer, filled with the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, the creak of leather, and the low murmur of Callum's voice. He was brushing one of the older mares, his movements slow and methodical. He didn't look up when she entered, but she knew he'd heard her. "I thought you'd be inside," he said without turning. "I wanted to see the horses," Ellis answered, stepping further into the barn. "I used to love them as a child, but I haven't been around them in years." He glanced at her then, his eyes flickering briefly to the mud on her boots before returning to the horse. "This one's named Clara. She's stubborn and old, but loyal." Ellis approached slowly, extending a cautious hand toward the horse's muzzle. Clara sniffed her fingers, then nudged her palm with a soft huff of breath. Ellis smiled. "She's beautiful," she murmured. "They all are if you know how to look," Callum said. He stepped aside, offering her the brush. "You want to try?" She hesitated, then took the brush. Her hand was unsteady at first, but Callum didn't correct her. He simply watched. After a few strokes, her rhythm evened out, and the mare relaxed under her touch. "I didn't think you'd let me come out here," Ellis said quietly. "It's not about letting," he replied. "This is your home now, too." She paused, lowering the brush. "It still doesn't feel like it." He didn't answer immediately. Then, "It didn't feel like mine for a long time either." They worked side by side in silence for a while, brushing, checking hooves, laying out fresh hay. The storm outside grew heavier, thunder shaking the rafters, rain drumming against the roof like a warning. But inside the barn, it felt strangely peaceful. When they finished tending to the horses, Callum led her toward the small tack room at the back. The space was narrow, lined with saddles, bridles, and worn leather gear. There was a bench against one wall and an old oil lamp that gave off a soft amber glow. He poured water into a metal cup and offered it to her. She accepted it with a quiet nod, sitting down to catch her breath. "You're not what I expected," he said, leaning against the opposite wall. Ellis looked up. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Someone angrier, someone who'd fight more, or cry, or run." "I've done all of that," she said, her voice steady. "Just not where you could see it." He didn't smile, but something in his face softened. "You're strong," he said. "I've had to be." He crossed his arms over his chest. "I've never really known what to do with someone who stays." Ellis met his gaze. "Then maybe don't do anything. Just let me be here." They sat like that for a while, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable. She studied the way his hands were always half-curled, as if ready to defend or retreat at a moment's notice. She saw the weariness in his posture, the tension in his shoulders, but also the way he didn't hide from her presence anymore. Suddenly, lightning flashed through the high windows of the barn, followed by a loud crack of thunder. The horses stirred anxiously, stomping and snorting. Clara let out a soft whinny. Callum was up in an instant, moving to the main stalls to check on them. Ellis followed without thinking, her boots slipping slightly in the wet straw. As she approached the gate to Clara's stall, a loud crack rang out above them, a tree branch crashing down onto the roof outside. Startled, Clara bucked and backed into the gate, causing it to swing open and hit Ellis squarely in the side. She stumbled backward, catching herself on the beam behind her, pain shooting through her ribs. Callum turned sharply at the sound, his expression darkening as he rushed toward her. He reached her before she could catch her breath. "You're hurt?" he asked, voice rough. "I'm all right," she said, but her voice was tight. He ignored her dismissal, stepping closer. "Where?" She touched her side gingerly. "Just bruised, I think." "Let me see," he said, and without waiting, he gently lifted the hem of her shirt just enough to reveal a forming welt beneath her ribs. His fingers, rough and calloused, barely grazed her skin, but it was the first time he'd truly touched her. Not out of obligation, not in ceremony, but from concern. His brows knit together as he examined the injury. Then he dropped his hand, his voice lower now. "I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened." "You didn't cause the storm," she replied softly. "No," he said, meeting her eyes. "But I brought you into it." They stood there in the barn, the rain roaring outside, the horses finally settling around them. And for the first time, Ellis didn't feel like an intruder. She felt like a witness, not just to Callum's grief, but to his effort, to the way he was trying, even if it was silent, even if it was broken. When they finally walked back toward the house, soaked and quiet, she felt something unfamiliar blooming inside her. Not comfort, not yet, but the start of trust. The storm lingered through the night, rolling across the sky with slow, deliberate force. Rain hammered against the windows of the house, and the wind rattled the shutters like a warning from something ancient and unsettled. Inside, the lights flickered occasionally, the old electrical wiring of the farmhouse groaning under the pressure of nature's fury. Ellis sat curled in the corner of the parlor, wrapped in a thick blanket, a half-read book resting on her knees. But she hadn't turned a page in over an hour. Her side ached from the blow she'd taken in the barn, though she didn't complain. The bruise was deep and tender, a blue-black mark just below her ribs that throbbed each time she moved too quickly. But it wasn't the pain that occupied her. It was the look on Callum's face when he touched her. Gentle, unsteady. Like he wasn't sure whether he had the right to care. Lucinda had gone to bed early, her health growing more fragile with each passing week. She moved slower now, spoke in shorter sentences, and often forgot where she left things. Ellis had taken to helping her without being asked, memorizing her tea schedule, the location of her medications, and the way she liked her blankets folded. It had become second nature, this quiet caretaking, not because she felt obligated, but because it gave her a sense of purpose. Callum hadn't come inside right away after the barn incident. He stayed out until nearly midnight, seeing to the horses, checking the damage, and then simply sitting in the barn with the lamp burning low. When he finally did enter the house, soaked and silent, he had paused in the kitchen doorway, his hair dripping onto the wood floor, his shoulders heavy beneath his wet shirt. Ellis hadn't spoken. She simply handed him a towel and a dry shirt she'd fetched from the laundry. He took them with a small nod, said nothing, and disappeared upstairs. Now, hours later, the house had gone still again. But Ellis was wide awake, her mind turning over thoughts she couldn't quiet. She wasn't sure what had shifted between them, but something had. It was like standing on the edge of a frozen lake and hearing the first crack beneath your feet. Dangerous, but impossible to ignore. He was letting her see pieces of him, small ones, like a man unlocking doors one at a time, to rooms he hadn't entered in years. Around 2 in the morning, the lights finally cut out completely. The bulb in the parlor died with a soft pop, and the house was cast into darkness. Ellis waited a few minutes, hoping it would come back on, but it didn't. She reached for the oil lantern Lucinda kept near the fireplace and lit it with a match, its warm glow pushing the shadows back just enough to see. She thought about going back to bed, but her ribs ached too much to lie comfortably. So she made tea by candlelight, boiled water over the gas stove, and sat again in the parlor, listening to the creaking bones of the house settle around her. That was when she heard it, a soft sound from upstairs, a door opening, then slow footsteps descending the stairs. She turned and saw Callum at the base of the staircase, barefoot, wearing a plain white t-shirt and old sweatpants. His face was tired, his hair disheveled from sleep, but his eyes were clear, alert. "Power's out," she said softly, holding up the lantern. "I figured," he replied, voice thick with sleep. "Storm finally took something." "Do you need anything?" she asked. He shook his head, then walked slowly into the room, lowering himself into the armchair across from her. For a moment, they just sat there, the lantern flickering between them, casting long shadows on the walls. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Not really," she admitted. "My side hurts." He frowned slightly. "You should have said something. I could have brought ice or a wrap." "It's not that bad," she said. "Just uncomfortable." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let me see." She hesitated, unsure if he meant it seriously. But when he met her eyes, she saw no hesitation in his, only concern. She set the teacup down, stood slowly, and walked to where he sat. He motioned for her to turn, and she did, carefully lifting the side of her shirt to reveal the bruise. Callum let out a slow breath. His fingers brushed the edge of the discoloration, gentle, barely applying pressure. "It's deep," he said. "You should be resting." "I've been resting all day," she murmured. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "I'm sorry." "You already said that." "I mean for more than just the barn." Ellis turned to face him. "What else?" "For bringing you here like this. For not knowing how to make you feel welcome. For treating you like a burden when you've never once acted like one." Her breath caught. She wasn't expecting that. Honesty, raw and unvarnished. It hung between them like a fragile thread. "I didn't expect you to welcome me," she said. "I was a stranger too. I still am." "You're not," he said firmly this time. "Not anymore." Ella sat down beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. The rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle, tapping rhythmically against the roof. For a long time they sat in silence, the lantern glow dancing over their features. "I used to think love had to be loud," she said quietly. "Big gestures, grand words. But I think now, maybe it's just choosing someone. Every day, even when it's hard, even when you don't know how." Callum looked at her, his gaze steady. "Then I'm still learning, but I want to try." She felt her heart ache at the simplicity of his confession. "You don't have to know everything yet," she said. "Just stay." "I will," he promised. He stood slowly, his hand brushing her shoulder as he passed. It wasn't a caress. It wasn't possession. It was an anchor, a quiet, physical acknowledgement of presence. Before he climbed the stairs, he turned back to look at her one more time. "Good night, Ellis." "Good night, Callum." And when she finally went to bed an hour later, the power still out, the bruise still aching, the storm finally fading, she lay beneath the covers and thought about the way he said her name. Like it meant something now. Like she meant something now. The days that followed passed in a rhythm so subtly altered that Ellis didn't notice the change at first. It was in the way Callum's eyes lingered on her when she walked into a room, not just out of politeness or obligation, but as if he needed to confirm that she was still there. It was in the way he started leaving small things on the kitchen counter, an apple he'd picked, a folded blanket she'd once said she liked, never handed to her directly, but left like offerings. And it was in the way he didn't flinch when their hands brushed or when she leaned a little closer while reaching for something. These weren't declarations. They weren't romantic in any traditional sense. But they were movement. They were the first signs of thawing. Lucinda noticed it too. One afternoon as they sat on the back porch shelling peas, her hands slow but practiced, she glanced over at Ellis with a look that was more amusement than surprise. "He's different now," she said simply. Ellis looked up. "Who?" Lucinda gave a small smile. "Don't pretend you don't know. He used to walk around this place like he was waiting for it to bury him. Now he walks like he's got something to return to." Ellis lowered her gaze, her cheeks warming. "It's not me. He's just healing, slowly." "Maybe," Lucinda said, "or maybe you're what made the healing start." Later that day, Callum came in early from the stables. His shirt was damp with sweat, his face streaked with dust. He looked tired, but there was a brightness in his eyes that hadn't been there weeks ago. He found Ellis in the kitchen, kneading dough for the bread she'd learned to make under Lucinda's quiet guidance. For a moment, he just stood in the doorway, watching her sleeves rolled up to the elbows, flour on her hands, the muscles in her forearms tightening with each motion. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on the dough beneath her fingers. "You're getting good at that," he said finally, his voice low. She glanced up, smiling faintly. "I've had good teachers." He stepped further into the kitchen. "You've made this house smell like a home again." She paused, hands stilling in the dough. "It didn't before?" "No, it smelled like time standing still." They shared a long, quiet look. Then she returned to kneading, and he stood beside her, watching. After a moment without speaking, he reached forward and helped. His hands were larger, rougher, but surprisingly gentle. They worked side by side, the rhythm easy between them. Their fingers touched more than once, but neither pulled away. Later that evening, Callum asked if she wanted to walk with him, just a short stretch beyond the house, where the grass was thick and tall and the fences gave way to a winding stream. She agreed, curious, unsure of what he meant by the offer, but not willing to refuse it. They walked in silence at first, the air cool from recent rain, the sky a pale blue just starting to slip into dusk. The land spread out before them, open and endless. Birds sang somewhere in the trees, and the world felt softened, as if it too were exhaling after a long time holding its breath. When they reached the stream, Callum stopped. He looked out over the water, the light glinting off its surface, his hands in his pockets. Ellis waited, sensing that he'd brought her here for a reason. "This is where I came the night after May died," he said, voice quiet. "I sat on that rock over there and thought about walking into the current and not coming back." Ellis said nothing. Her chest tightened, but she didn't move. She just listened. "I didn't because I kept thinking about the horses, about my mother, about how they would keep waiting, keep standing there, not knowing I wasn't coming. I couldn't leave them like that." He finally turned to look at her. "I don't tell you this because I want pity. I tell you because I want you to understand something about who I was before you came here." "I don't see that man," Ellis said softly. "Not anymore." Callum's mouth moved like he was about to speak, but then he simply nodded, as if that truth was too big to put into words. They stood there for a long moment, watching the stream move quietly between its banks. Then unexpectedly he reached for her hand. It was not a grand gesture, not some sweeping act of romance. It was hesitant, unsure, his fingers brushing the back of hers before curling gently around them. Ellis's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. She let their hands stay together, let the warmth pass between them, let the silence around them settle into something deep and fragile. When they walked back to the house, their hands remained linked. That night, neither of them spoke much. But when Callum walked her to the stairs, he paused at the base. "If you ever want a different room," he said, "or to share one, if you ever want that, it would be yours by choice, not obligation." Ellis met his gaze. There was no pressure in his tone, no urgency, just truth, and something like hope. "I'm not ready yet," she said gently, "but I'm not afraid anymore." He nodded. "That's enough for me." As she climbed the stairs, she turned back once to see him still standing there, watching her, not like a man waiting, but like a man who had found a reason to. That night, the ache in her ribs had faded, but another ache had taken its place, quieter, deeper, and more dangerous. It was the ache of wanting someone, not because she had to, but because she was beginning to choose to. The air on the ranch had changed. It wasn't anything visible or loud, but it lived in the little things. The way the doors no longer echoed so sharply when closed. The way Ellis hummed quietly to herself while hanging linens on the line. The way Callum paused just a little longer in a room she was in. They were not lovers, not yet, and still not quite a traditional husband and wife, but something had undeniably shifted between them. The distance that once sat between their silences had thinned, softened by gestures that asked nothing and yet offered everything. The fear in Ellis's chest had begun to loosen. Where there used to be tension and caution, there was now a quiet expectancy, like something not yet spoken was just on the edge of blooming. Lucinda had noticed it, though she said little these days. Her health was declining faster than either of them would admit aloud. The fire in her spirit remained, but her body was betraying her, her steps shorter, her cough deeper, her naps longer. Still, she smiled more when Ellis entered the room, and there was a peacefulness in her gaze when she looked at her son that hadn't been there before. One morning, while Ellis helped her button her cardigan, Lucinda gently placed her hand over Ellis's and whispered, "I won't be here to see everything through, but I know now he won't be alone. You were the answer I didn't know how to pray for." Ellis hadn't known what to say to that. She simply nodded and wrapped her arms gently around the frail woman, holding her like a daughter would hold a mother she was trying not to lose too soon. Later that day, the sky was clear, wide and open above the ranch, and Callum found Ellis out by the old fence behind the barn, where she often walked after finishing her chores. She had taken to feeding the wild birds with handfuls of seed, and they had begun to recognize her presence, flying down without fear when she appeared. He leaned on the fence beside her, quiet for a while, watching the birds flutter and peck at the ground. "There's a harvest festival in town this weekend," he said after a few moments, his voice casual but deliberate. Ellis blinked, looking up at him. "I didn't know. I usually don't go. Haven't in years." He paused. "But Lucinda asked if we might. All three of us. She used to love it." Ellis's chest tightened. "Do you want to go?" He looked at her, then away again. "I don't want to go without you." She didn't answer right away, but her heart beat a little faster. "Then let's go." On the day of the festival, Lucinda wore her best shawl, her hair pulled back in a simple twist, and for the first time in weeks, color returned to her face. Callum wore a dark button-up shirt that Ellis had ironed for him, and he looked different in it. Less like the man who carried so much of the land on his back, and more like someone trying to remember who he used to be. Ellis wore a light blue dress that Lucinda had found tucked away in an old trunk, and though it was plain, the way Callum looked at her when she stepped out of her room made her feel like she was wearing something extraordinary. The town square was filled with laughter and music, warm light strung between the trees, children running with sticky hands, booths set up with pies and jams and wood carvings. It was the first time Ellis had been in public with Callum since the wedding, and while no one made a scene, she could feel the eyes, curious, measuring, some quietly judging. She stood a little closer to him, and he seemed to feel it because his hand brushed against hers and stayed there. They walked the grounds slowly, with Lucinda pausing every so often to rest. People came to greet them, many unfamiliar to Ellis but known to Callum. He introduced her each time with a quiet, "My wife," that made her stomach twist in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't possessive, wasn't showy, it was gentle, grounding. And every time he said it, something inside her began to believe it a little more. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned to a honeyed gold, there was music from the center of the square, an old fiddle tune that turned into a dance. Couples began to gather, and Ellis smiled as Lucinda clapped softly along with the rhythm. Callum didn't dance, she knew that much, but just when she began to suggest they head back, he surprised her. "Would you?" he asked, offering his hand. Her breath caught. "Dance?" He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "Only if you promise not to laugh if I get the steps wrong." She took his hand, and he led her to the edge of the makeshift dance floor. They were awkward at first. He was stiff, and she was unsure. But then the music took hold, and slowly, their bodies began to find each other's rhythm. They didn't speak, just moved, the world falling away around them. Her hand fit into his, her other resting lightly on his shoulder. His palm was warm at her waist. They weren't graceful, but they were together, and that was enough. When the song ended, he didn't let go immediately. Their eyes met, and the look he gave her was different from any he'd given her before. Not guarded, not burdened, just open. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For coming with me. For dancing. For staying." She didn't respond, only looked up at him, heart pounding, breath shallow. And then, without thinking, without planning, he leaned in and kissed her. It was soft, tentative, as if he were asking a question he wasn't sure she wanted answered. His lips barely brushed hers, lingering long enough to say everything he couldn't voice. When he pulled back, he searched her face for any sign of regret. But she simply stood there, eyes wide, lips parted, and then leaned forward and kissed him again. This time it was Ellis who asked the question, and in doing so, gave her answer. They didn't speak much on the ride home. Lucinda had dozed off in the back seat, and Ellis sat quietly beside Callum, her hand resting on his, fingers laced. The stars were out in full by the time they returned, and the house glowed faintly in the distance, welcoming them home. Inside, Callum walked her to the bottom of the staircase, just as he had before. But tonight he didn't stop her from continuing upward. He simply stood at the bottom step, watching, until she paused halfway and looked back. "Good night, Callum," she said, her voice softer than ever. "Good night, Ellis," he replied, and in the silence that followed, neither of them said the words forming just behind their tongues. But they didn't need to. The truth had already begun to settle into the spaces between them, and for the first time since the day they married, It no longer felt like strangers living in a house together. It felt like something far more dangerous. It felt like home. Autumn arrived quietly, slipping into the land like an old friend returning after a long absence. The heat of summer softened into crisp breezes that carried the scent of hay, pine, and distant smoke. The fields turned golden, and the trees blushed with color: rust, amber, deep red. Life on the ranch settled into a slower rhythm. Mornings were misty and cold, and the days grew shorter, urging everything to prepare for winter. But inside the farmhouse, something else was blooming. Something tender and slow, something neither Ellis nor Callum had the language for, though they both knew it was real. In the weeks since the festival, the changes between them became quiet habits rather than dramatic gestures. Ellis had moved her things into Callum's room, not with fanfare or discussion, but with a shared understanding. One night, she simply carried her books and her folded sweaters across the hallway and placed them on the shelves. He didn't comment. He just made room. That night, they slept in the same bed, back to back. No words, no pressure, only presence. Over time, they grew accustomed to the sound of each other's breathing, to the feeling of shared warmth under the blankets, to the hush that followed a long day when no words were necessary, because everything that mattered was already known. Their intimacy was not rushed. It unfolded like the changing season, deliberate, natural, quiet. There were nights when Callum would reach for her hand under the sheets, his fingers slipping between hers, grounding him when sleep refused to come. There were mornings when she woke to find his arm draped over her waist, his face buried in the pillow, just inches away. And then slowly, without the need to mark a date or define the moment, their marriage became real. Not a contract, not a duty, but a bond. Lucinda watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. Her strength waned quickly now, her voice thinner, her steps more uncertain. Yet she smiled more. She spoke of things she hadn't in years. She asked Ellis to sit with her often in the garden or by the window in the parlor. And sometimes, when she was strong enough, she asked to be taken out to the stables to see the horses. She and Callum talked more now, too, though most of their conversations were made of memory and forgiveness. One morning, Lucinda placed her hand over her son's and whispered, "You did better than I ever dared hope. You didn't just survive, Callum. You learned to live again." The day Lucinda passed, the sky was overcast and still. She slipped away in her sleep, her hand in Ellis's, her breath slowing until it simply stopped. There was no struggle, no gasping, only peace. Ellis sat with her long after the last breath, tears streaming down her face, not from shock or fear, but from the ache of losing someone she had come to love deeply. She closed Lucinda's eyes gently, pressed a kiss to her temple, and whispered, "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for seeing me." Callum found her like that, still holding Lucinda's hand, and knelt beside her without a word. He didn't cry, not right away. He just leaned his head against his mother's arm and stayed there, silent, as the weight of grief settled over them both like snowfall. The funeral was simple, as Lucinda had requested. No flowers, no elaborate service. Just the three of them, Callum, Ellis, and the old pastor who had married them. A few neighbors came to offer quiet condolences, and then the house was still again. The night after the funeral, Callum sat on the porch in the dark, staring out at the moonlit fields. Ellis joined him, pulling a blanket over both their shoulders, and together they sat there, grieving not in words but in shared silence. In the days that followed, they fell into a quiet that was heavier than before, but not hopeless. There were things that needed to be done: paperwork, estate matters, tending to the ranch. Ellis took on more responsibilities, not because anyone asked her to, but because she could feel the way Callum was carrying too much. They worked side by side in the barn, rode out to check the fences, fed the horses. They cooked together, cleaned together, and at night they lay in bed, wrapped around each other, clinging not just to warmth, but to the comfort of a body that promised it wasn't going anywhere. One evening, weeks after the funeral, Callum came home from the field later than usual, his boots heavy with mud, his face drawn from the day's labor. Ellis met him at the door, and instead of stepping aside to let him pass, she wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head on his chest. He froze for just a moment, surprised, then held her tightly, burying his face in her hair. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice rough. "You don't have to," she whispered. "No, I do. For staying, for making this place feel alive again, for giving me something to wake up for. Ellis pulled back just enough to look up at him. You gave me a life too, Callum. Before I came here, I was a name on paper, a body filling space. I didn't know who I was, but now I do. I'm yours. Not because I had to be, not because someone signed a piece of paper, but because I choose to be. He stared at her, and in his eyes was something that had never been there before. Not just affection or gratitude, but awe, as if he was seeing her for the first time and couldn't believe his luck. He kissed her then, deeply, fully, with no hesitation. Not as an apology, not as a test, but as a declaration. She kissed him back with everything she had, and when he picked her up and carried her upstairs to their bed, there was no fear, no question, only warmth, only closeness, only two souls that had finally found their way home. Later that night, lying tangled in the sheets, the windows open to the sound of wind through the trees, Callum pulled her close and whispered, I didn't choose you at first, Ellis, but I would choose you now 1,000 times over. She pressed her lips to his collarbone and murmured, I know, and I'd still say yes. Outside, the wind stirred the tall grass. The horses shifted in their stalls. The stars burned quietly overhead. And inside, two people who had once been strangers held each other like a vow. They had been brought together by circumstance, shaped by grief, bonded by silence. But now they had chosen love. And that made all the difference.